So in a book from several years ago called Writing Through Translations and Variations, I tried to put together some examples of my practice with translation and with other forms of appropriation and collage. The resultant work, then, centered on a selection of the translations that I've made over the last, 50, 60 years, while it expanded from there to take in the other work related, in my view, to translation as such. With this in mind, I thought of John Cage's term, writing through, as a title, and translations and variations as a subtitle that would suggest the range of my own workings. I have also used the word otherings, to cover all those possibilities. In the process, I have become aware that the translations to which I felt most committed were largely of works not previously translated or from sources, both individuals and cultures, outside of the canonical mainstream at the point at which I came at them. And at the same time, I have tried to be true to the problematics of translation and composition, and by so doing to raise in ways both personal and impersonal the age-old questioning of self and other. To the degree that this holds true, I would suggest it as a theme for all my workings and let it go at that. My earlier thoughts follow with enough actual examples, I hope, to add to the interest. I had thought for a long time of preparing a book of selected translations and was faced again and again by the dilemma of where the translations end and my other writings begin. It seemed to me finally that there was a number of ways, in which translation served me as a form of composition and as an underpinning for much of my work as a poet and writer, and I believe that this holds true for other poets as well. I have never thought of myself as a professional translator, since my grasp of any language other than English has been limited and has made any translation on which I've worked a slow and sometimes very indirect process, often too in the case of languages that are exotic from our point of view in collaboration with other translators. I have not as a rule added to or subtracted from the original when translating, but within those limits I have thought of myself as a poet using translation as a means for making poems or bringing new poems into English. Even more than that, I have had a need, I emphasize, a need to translate, and by translating, to connect with the work and thought of other poets, a matter of singular importance to me in what I have long taken to be my project and the central activity of my life as a poet. I do not think of this as in any way unusual, although it has taken me a long time to recognize it for what it is. Many writers, but poets in particular, inherit and carry forward the work of those who came before them. In my own case, the work I've done with ethnopoetics and with the construction of anthology assemblages, along with a devotion to the experimental as a basis for my writing, has made such considerations still more central to my practice. Accordingly, my work has involved not only translation, but the use of techniques like collage and appropriation as ways of opening our individual or personal poetry to the presence of other voices and other visions besides our own. I came to think of all of that, appropriation, collage, translation, in ideological terms. Long before our time, Whitman in Leaves of Grass had set the task very plainly. Through me, many long, dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations of prisoners and slaves, voices of the diseased and despairing and of thieves and dwarfs, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion, and of the threads that connect the stars, and of wombs, and of the father stuff, and of the rights of them the others are down upon, of the deformed, trivial, flat, foolish, despised, fog in the air, beetles rolling balls of dung. So that goes pretty far. This was in the section of Leaves of Grass called Song of Myself. that great bringing together of the individual voice with a sense of a total and suppressed humanity. And it was reborn for us, for me certainly, in Charles Olson's rant, say, against the lyrical interference of the individual as ego, or in Robert Duncan's call for a new symposium of the whole, a new totality among my immediate predecessors and near contemporaries. I have practiced translation in one form or another for more than 50 years now. My first published book, in fact, which you mentioned, was New Young German Poets in 1959, published by Lawrence Ferlinghetti's City Lights. Bringing me in that one move into the midst of the Beat generation. And so that was a year before my own first book of poetry, my own first self-published, because Diane and I and a couple of other people had started a publishing company called Hawkswell Press. But New Young German Poets included those first-time translations into English from Celan and Günter Grass and Hans Magnus Enzensberger, Ingeborg Bachmann, Helmut Heisenbüttel, who would become major authors in the decade that followed. In the 1960s, stepping out of my usual persona, I adapted Ralph Hochut's play, The Deputy, Der Stellvertreter, for its Broadway performance, did further translations from Enzensberger's poetry, and began to make occasional translations of Dada poets like Hans Arp and Richard Hilsenbeck from German, and Tristan Tzara and Francis Picabia from French. I had also become engaged with translations from Spanish modernists, much of it for my own recreation and as a way better to understand the work at hand. And from 1960 on, I began to use translation as a way to channel material into publications of my own. So this is straight translation. And I'll read translations from Paul Celan and from Pablo Neruda, but I'll start in each case with my clumsy version of the original language, just the opening of the two poems. Celan's most famous poem, which I think finally got on his nerves because it became so famous, was called Todesfuge, or Death Fugue, and comes out of his experience of almost ending as his parents did, in extermination camp during the Second World War. And you'll see what I'm after I think, if I do German and the English following. So a death fugue, and it begins this way. Schwarze Milch der Frühe, wir trinken sie abends, wir trinken sie mittags und morgens, wir trinken sie nachts, wir trinken und trinken, wir schaufeln ein Grab in den Lüften, da liegt man nicht eng. Ein Mann wohnt im Haus, der spielt mit den Schlangen, der schreibt, wenn es dunkelt nach Deutschland, dein goldenes Haar, Margareta. Er schreibt es und tritt vor das Haus und es blitzen der Sterne. Er pfeift seine Rüden herbei, er pfeift seine Juden hervor, lässt schaufeln ein Grab in der Erde. Er befiehlt uns, spiel auf, nun zum Tanz. Black milk of morning, we drink you at dusk time. We drink you at noontime and dawn time. We drink you at night. We drink and drink. There's a man in this house who cultivates snakes and who writes when it's nightfall. Nach Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta. He writes it and walks in the house and the stars all start flashing. He whistles his dogs to draw near, whistles his Jews to appear, starts us scooping a grave out of sand. He commands us, play up for the dance. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night, we drink you at dawn time and noontime, we drink you at dusk time, we drink and drink. There's a man in this house who cultivates snakes and who writes when it's nightfall, nach Deutschland, your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Shulamit. We scoop out a grave in the sky where it's roomy to lie. He calls, jab it deep in the soil, you men, you other men, sing and play. He tugs at the sword in his belt, he swings it, his eyes are blue. Jab your spades deeper, you men, you other men, play up again for the dance. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night, we drink you at noontime and dawn time, we drink you at dusk time, we drink and drink. There's a man in this house, your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Shulamit. He cultivates snakes, he calls, play that death thing more sweetly, death is a straw boss aus Deutschland. He calls, scrape that fiddle more darkly, then hover like smoke in the air, then scoop out a grave in the clouds where it's roomy to lie. Black milk of morning, we drink you at night, we drink you at noontime. Death is a straw boss aus Deutschland. We drink you at dawn time and dawn time. We drink and drink. Death is a straw boss aus Deutschland. His eye is blue. He hits you with leaden bullets. His aim is true. There's a man in this house, your golden hair, Margareta. He sets his dogs on our trail. He gives us a grave in the sky. He cultivates snakes and he dreams. Death is a straw boss aus Deutschland. Your golden hair, Margareta, your ashen hair, Shulamit. So I'm trying to, I've got Ceylon's rhythm in my head, and bringing it into English. And, and as I did, because we were into performance, it became part of the performance, of course, always with credit to Ceylon, but, and from Neruda, starting from his Spanish. It's a poem called in the Spanish version, given an English title, Walking Around. And in my translation, I changed that to Walking Around. Walking, apostrophe, around. Sucede que me canso de ser hombre. Sucede que entro en las sastrerías y en los cines, marchito, impenetrable como un cisne de fieltro, navegando en un agua de origen y ceniza. El olor de las peluquerías me hacen llorar a gritos. Solo quiero un descanso de piedras o de lana. Solo quiero no ver establecimientos, ni jardines, ni mercaderías, ni anteojos, ni ascensores. Sucede me canso de mis pies, mis uñas, mi pelo, mi sombra. Sucede me canso de ser hombre. It just so happens that I'm tired of being a man. It just so happens that I walk into tailor shops and movies, withered, impenetrable, a flannel swan that steers across a sea of origins and ashes. The odors from a barber shop can start me bawling. I only want a little rest from stones and wool. I only want to see my last of institutes and gardens, of merchandise, of eyeglasses, of elevators. It just so happens that I'm tired of my feet and my nails and my hair and my shadow. It just so happens that I'm tired of being a man. And yet, how delightful it would be to threaten some accountant with the head of a lily, or murder a nun with a blow on the ear. How beautiful to go through streets with a green knife and holler out loud till I die of frostbite. I don't want to keep on being a root in the darkness, irresolute, pulled from all sides till a dream leaves me shaking, dragged down through the seeping bowels of the earth, absorbing and thinking, stuffed with food every day. I don't want all that grief on my shoulders. I don't want to keep on as a root in a tomb, alone underground, a wine cellar stocked with the dead, frozen stiff, half gone with the pain. So the day called Monday starts burning like oil when it sees me pull in with my face of a jailhouse, and it howls on its way like a wounded wheel and leaves tracks of hot blood in the direction of night, and it shoves me into certain dark corners, into certain moist houses, into hospitals where bones sail through the windows, into certain shoemaker shops with their odors of vinegar, into streets full of terrible holes. There are birds the color of sulfur and horrible guts that swing from the doors of houses that I hate. There are false teeth forgotten in a coffee pot. There are mirrors that ought to be crying from shame and terror. There are umbrellas wherever I look, and poisons and belly buttons. I walk around with my calm, with my eyes, with my shoes, with my anger, with my memory failing. I move on, I wander through offices and orthopedic shops and courtyards where clothes are hung from a wire, underdrawers, towels, and nightgowns that cry slow tears full of dirt. So from some point in the 1960s then, or maybe from the very start, I began to use translation as a way to channel material into publications of my own. Where that channeling turns up most clearly is in the acts of translation that are an underpinning for the big anthologies, Technicians of the Sacred, Shaking the Pumpkin, Poems for the Millennium, and so on, that I began assembling in the later 1960s, though I must point out that, that most of the translations in those books, are by other translators. But I join into that, and I do the assembling. And the translations there also led me to an interplay with poets closer to my own time and place. Kurt Schwitters, Federico Garcia Lorca, the Czech poet Vítězslav Nezval. Among those I've done in abundance. And still later, and surprisingly to me, and I think it was the last big translation work I got into, along with Pierre Joris, the collected poems of Picasso. For me, too, the big books were a kind of assemblage and collage, very much like the translations in terms of what they allowed me to do or to be. In the big books, the ethno-poetic ones in particular, I was engaged with a range of processes related to, but not always identical to that of translation. Some of those, the more clearly translational ones, involved experimental forms of translation with perhaps an emphasis on the translation of oral poetry and, conversely, of visual poetry, a fascination with what had been thought of as untranslatable forms of poetry. In the 17 horse songs of Frank Mitchell, from sources in Navajo, I engaged in what Dennis Tedlock and I were calling total translation, going beyond the semantic level to try to find equivalents for the non-lexical vocables in Navajo song and even, most outrageously for me, for the music, the melodies by which the words and sounds were carried. Other Indian song poems, those mostly from the Seneca, were short combinations of words and sounds, which I chose to translate as a kind of visual, concrete poetry, in order to bring across the curious complexity of otherwise simple or minimal forms by calling up an image of similar minimal forms in our own, presumably sophisticated and developed arts of language, and along the same lines, while working with contemporary poems that were themselves experimental, I undertook the translation of a large group of often minimal poems by the German concrete poet Eugen Gomringer, finding those a curious vehicle to get down to some fundamentals about the nature of both poetry and translation. So let me do a little on total translation. From Shaking the Pumpkin, and this follows a period of what otherwise would be called field work for me. But we lived in New York City, and not far away, a car ride away, long car ride, from the Allegheny Seneca Iroquois Reservation in western New York State. And I worked there with the Seneca songmaker, Richard Johnny John. The title Shaking the Pumpkin is the Seneca designation in English of a fundamental medicine ceremony. So I did a series of songs from the Society of the Mystic Animals, what they called Shaking the Pumpkin. And I can read those I didn't provide for PowerPoint here, but if you look into Shaking the Pumpkin, you'll see how they're set out on the page. But but they can also be read as minimal poems, without the visual component. And then I will do something else. A song of my song in 3 parts. It's off in the distance. It came into the room. It's here in the circle. Caw, caw, the crows, caw, caw. 1, the crows came in. 2, the crows sat down. 2 more about a crow in the manner of Zhukovsky. Louis Zhukovsky did a series of translations along with his wife Celia from the Roman poet Catullus. But although meaning comes through, what Louis is doing is playing with the sound of Catullus. I think it later came to be called homophonic translation. So I did that with a couple of Shaking the Pumpkin songs in the manner of Zhukovsky. 1, young cockcrow's way out. 2, hog, yes, swine, you're mine. That's really what the poems were about. But the sound, young cockcrow's way out, was young gagaweo, young gagaweo. Hog, yes, swine, you're mine. Onyak swine me. Where the song went, where she went, and what happened when they met. The song went to the garden. Heh heh heh. The song poked all around the garden. Heh heh heh. She went to the garden. Heh heh heh. She went to the garden. Heh heh heh. She went like crazy in the garden. Heh heh heh. That's where she went. Ha ha ha. And hey, when I sing this set of 4 songs, look what happened. This was turned into a rock and roll song by a group called the Rascals, back then. Hey, when I sing, hey, it can help her. Yeah, it can. Yeah, it's so strong. Hey, when I sing, hey, it can raise her. Yeah, it can. Yeah, it's so strong. Hey, when I sing, hey, her arm gets straighter. Yeah, it can. Yeah, it's so strong. Hey, when I sing, hey, her body gets straighter. Yeah, it can. Yeah, it's so strong. And then I found, like surprise, that I've been translating the Seneca song poems, into these visual forms. But I could also go back, and perform the translations. So the opening of the Shaking the Pumpkin ceremony in Seneca, it's Dayon Dawaje, one word, which means that are coming, is coming. And it's understood, that it's the animals of the ceremony. Dayon Dawaje, he he he. Dayon Dawaje, and you begin to get sounds, and I translate it like. Oh no! Don't sing the Seneca. The animals are coming. Hey, the animals are coming. Hey, 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 hey. are coming. The animals are coming. Hey, 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 hey. The animals are coming. Wah, yeah. Yeah, on the page, all of that, which the non-words, I would have found visual ways of presenting. So we don't drop that out, and that was a large part of what the total translation was about. For Dennis Tedlock, translating spoken narrative, it was to indicate breath pauses, the way the voice, sometimes is loud, sometimes is soft, the way it sometimes goes into a kind of sing-song pattern. So he showed all of that in the translations he did from, principally the translations from Zuni Indian narrative. And mine was a series of 17 horse blessing songs that were part of the medicine bundle of the Navajo Hatali singer, chanter, medicine person, Frank Mitchell. And they were transmitted to me, the material for this was transmitted to me by a great American ethnomusicologist, who was also a friend, David McAllister. And what I try to take into account here, not only the words, which is the way these things were usually translated, but the vocables, the non-translatable word-like sounds, the way the words are changed and distorted in the singing, and other elements. And then I usually point out at the end what was left to be translated, aside from the context itself. What was left to be translated was the music. So I'll perform a very short version of one of the horse songs, and you'll see that the music, is not Navajo. But then the words are not Navajo. The sounds are not Navajo. So that's, total translation, I came to believe is a total transformation, but that harkens back, to the original, from that it becomes possible. So in the 13th of the 17 horse songs, the hero, god, enemy slayer, killer of enemies, has been sent by his mother, changing woman, the earth goddess, to the house of his father, the sun god. And he's been given the spirit horses, the seeds or germs of horses that will turn into real horses in later historical time. And he imagines how beautiful they'll be when that happens. And so the refrain is, some are beautiful, some are lovely. John. Some are lovely now, but some are, and are at my house now, one and one buying wing. Some are lovely now, but some are, and are at my house now, and one buying wing. Some are lovely now, but some are, and are at my houses now, none buying wing, But by some non-wing now, because I wasn't con, I was the boy inside the dawn, but summer at my house now when one buying wing, and by going from the swollen Hogan house, my breath is blown, but summer at my house, and one buying wing, and by going from the house, the holy Hogan home, but summer at my house. Now and one buying wing with my spirit horses that are white and cone, but summer at my house, and one buying wing with those horses that are white shell now, but summer at my house. One buying wing, the jewels of every kind to go and draw them on, not summer at my own now, and one buying wing with horses of every kind to go, draw them on, not summer at my house now, and one buying wing, and men of every kind to go and draw them on, not summer at my house, and one buying wing, and everything that's gone before more. We walk upon the summer at my house now, and one buying wing, and everything that's now and living to be old and blessed now, but summer at my house now, and one buying wing, because I am the boy who blisses to be old, but summer at my house. One buying wing, summer lovely now, but summer under my house, and one buying wing, summer lovely now, but some are and are at my houses, none buying none wing, but now known by wing. Mister. So all of that remains central to me. The translations, I mean, and those other suppositions and legitimate acts of othering, something like what Haroldo de Campos, great Brazilian concrete and just a great Brazilian poet, called transcreation. All of those acts of othering that underlie my total project. In the Lorca variations, from which you read very nicely, I took a step beyond translation by writing with Lorca, or my translation of Lorca's book-length poem series called The Suites, in the musical sense, suites, isolating his nouns and other words, which were by then my own in English, and systematically recasting them into new compositions. Anecdotally, I had been commissioned to translate this never-before translated series of poems from Lorca for what was the Forrest Strauss collected translations of Lorca. So, by many different translators. But I thought there was a promise from Forrest Strauss, big publisher, that my translation of the suites would also be published as a separate small volume, and they reneged on that. So that started me doing the Lorca variations, and so I'll read part at least of a Lorca suite in my translation, and then a variation on that. And this was a suite. By suite, it means a series of small poems brought together thematically, And the title of the suite is Newton, as in Sir Isaac Newton, which seems like a curious topic for Lorca. And you'll see also, I hope, that the poems are very playful, because Lorca is not just a tragic poet, he is a very, playful, fanciful poet. Newton's nose. Onto the nose of Newton, a large apple falls. a meteor of truths, last fruit to dangle from the tree of science. And big Newton scratches his Saxon nostrils, a white moon over those barbaric strings of lace, the beech trees. In the woods, the gnomes astride their secrets tear their beards out. They tie up death and make the echoes mislead men with mirrors. In a corner lies the secret, in the open, dead. His companions mourn him, a blue boy with iron feet, a glowing star between his eyebrows. His companions mourn him, and the green lake trembles in the wind. Harmony. Waves rhyme with sighs and stars with crickets. A tremble in the cornea, the whole cold sky. A dot, a synthesis, infinities. But who joins waves with sighs and stars with crickets? Just hope these geniuses be missing something. The proofs keep drifting by among us. The philosopher's last walk. Newton was taking a walk. Death had followed him, strumming his guitar. Newton was taking a walk. The worms gnawed through his apple. The wind hummed in the trees, the river beneath the branches. Wordsworth would have cried. The philosopher was striking unimaginable poses, was waiting for another apple. He ran along the road. He stretched out by the water. He saw how his face would sink in the moon's reflection. Newton wept, and high up on a cedar, two old owls yammered. Slowly in the night, the wise man went back home. He dreamt enormous pyramids of apples. Question: why was it the apple and not the orange or the polyhedral pomegranate? Why this virgin fruit to clue them in, this smooth and gentle pippin? What admirable symbol lies dormant at its core? Adam, Paris, Newton carry it inside their souls and fondle it without a clue to what it is. The Law of Variations 11, Newton. 1. The men had green feet that vaulted them into the open where they could flaunt their secrets. Lace brushed lightly against their nostrils as the apple tree loomed over Newton with its fruits. It is so Saxon to bind gnomes with string, to watch your echoes drifting off in secret, your lost companions jangling irons in the wind. Not every boy has such sad eyebrows, nor would every corner spare an inch for death. In the woods, the moon showed Newton where the truth lies. Following his nose, he slammed into a meteor named Newton. He mistook it for a science that was white, like beech trees or like beards. But once he caught it in his mirror, saw it turn blue again. At length, it looked like every other star or lake. 2. Every wise man considers himself another Newton, a philosopher musing beside trees and water, going for a walk or coming from a walk, pulling genies out of waves and sky, with which sigh makes a perfect rhyme. Their corneas are focused on infinity and disregard the lowly cricket, just as Newton did. And just as Newton knew the wind, or Wordsworth knew a certain word to be the night's reflection, so apples floating on a wave of crickets make a synthesis more powerful than stars. Philosophers should play guitars, then, reaching for those apple branches where the moon's a lowly apple. Pyramids adorned with owls express a kind of harmony, and stars are dots and are a proof of death more powerful than worms. What if the river strikes a pose? The cedar will show a face that brings it home. 3. There isn't a clue that the fruit into which Adam bit was an apple and not his lady's breast. Above them, Pegasus kept flying past, all in the name of science. The Virgin handed him a second apple, which Adam turned into a questioning of history. Deep in its core, the Virgin saw souls rise and fall, a symbol Newton later found inside a pomegranate. Only a child can play with apples and touch beauty. Newton and Adam, both were satisfied with Eve's reply, the first she gave when she woke up in chains, her innocence laid by. Paris, in the other tale, held up an orange. And this one, just because it talks about what I'm doing with Lorca, the Lorca Variations 21, The Return. It's in, I think, 4 parts. Yeah. To write through Lorca, to come back on Lorca's wings, to return to where you're feeling empty like dying sweetly after love, to where a rose has left you wounded, the shadow of your childhood, like a flower inside your heart, where Lorca's road trails off into a garden in which the morning star drops colors onto a faded dress like paint. To come back on Lorca's wings, who sees his origin in water, sees his soul die in a dream, transform into a corazon forever, sees a shadow overwhelm the flower in his heart and cry goodbye until his soul returns to him, a muddy spot from which a butterfly arises, shivering, a gust of wind in motion through his heart. To see his origin in water in the dawn, a feeble light, the motion of her corazon, of Lorca's wings in water, making love down at the oxbow, hearing the nightingales, a love as sweet as perfume, goodbyes and reminiscences turned into songs, a girl and a muchacho turning and returning through the spray. To return with Lorca only yesterday, to walk along the sea under the stars, to see the forest becoming green forever, green with love, the shadow of our childhood like a flower crying adios, while marching single file up to a crossroads, reciting the songs we made, white muslin shaking, trailing along the byways, the glitter that drops down from Lorca's wings, words that we write through Lorca. And there are numerous other poems, series of poems, in which I was using devices, that brought others in or other languages in. It was translation, but I think the compos's transcreation can probably cover, all of it, or just, so I would have a different word. I was going to point to a series of poems in which I had become aware of Hebrew Jewish mystical numerology, procedure called gematria from the Greek. And this played off the fact that the Hebrew alphabet was also taken as a series of numbers. Aleph number 1, Bet number 2. So every letter is a number. Therefore, every word is a sum of numbers. And two words which come to the same sum must have some relationship to each other, So that was interesting. Mysticism, particularly on the side of mystical linguistics, has always been a matter of fascination for me. And then, quite by chance, browsing through a Hebrew Jewish artifacts and books at a bookshop in St. Louis. I came on a book called Gematria, The Spice of Torah. Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And this was a book that had all of the words in the first 5 books in the Torah with their numerical equivalents. And as you looked at a page, you saw words relating to each other and making, again, little minimal poems. And then, of course, I could add words, together, and, I could, play my own mystical, poetic, Kabbalistic games with that. So I'll read some of the poems in one of the series called Fourth Gematria, and subtitled In the Shadow. The first poem reads, "Without God, without terror." And you'll pick up there that one of the Hebrew words for God and one of the Hebrew words for terror, are equivalent: God, terror. Gematria 372. 7, plenty, a week. My heart 1, flaming. My heart 2, blood. Colors 1, yellow stars. Colors 2, his red throne. The candlestick, the fire, the yellow Baal eats like a god. You and a double. The city, broken, void. The rock fell. A curse, your father shall live. And I did a whole book of Gematria. And then a project came along. An artist friend, Arya Gallis, was doing a series of monumental charcoal drawings as a testament to Holocaust. And he very powerfully distanced himself, rather than mawkish, pictures of agonized bodies and so on. Took World War II aerial photographs, of 14 extermination camps, and did very photoreal images, and quite large charcoal. And I thought that was a good thing to do. But Arya wanted poems to accompany it. He wanted words in there that, that he would do in sort of slim side panels, and also writing the words out in charcoal. And he wanted to take from a book of mine called Khurban, a book I did, with Holocaust as a theme, but using the Yiddish Hebrew-derived word Khurban for that. And I said, no, Ari, you don't take my poems and cut them up to decorate your great charcoal drawings, but why don't I write a series of poems using Gematria, and we'll spell out the names of the 14 camps, each with its railroad station, therefore 14 stations, as in the 14 stations of the cross. We will take the names of the camps in their Hebrew or Yiddish spellings, and work Gematria with them. So we did that, and this is what that comes to. I'll maybe even say a little after I read it. Well, no, I'll say it now. That the words are derived from Scripture, from the Bible, is of some importance, to the. There's a certain unity that comes into the poems, and a certain tonality that comes into the poems because of that, but otherwise, fairly relaxed. The first station, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now the serpent. I will bring back their taskmasters, crazy and mad. Will meet them down in the valley and be subdued, separated in life, uncircumcised, needy, shoes stowed away. How naked they come, my fathers, angry and trembling, the serpents you have destroyed, their faces remembered, small in your eyes, shut down, soiled. See a light take shape in the pit, someone killed, torn in pieces, a terror, a god, go down deeper. In some later poems, series of poems called A Book of Witness, from which I think I read the other night, in which I'm putting particular stress on the first person pronoun I. But the I is the short sentences with I, often taken from other writers, other poets, particularly contemporaries of mine. And then giving myself the freedom to I'm not doing confessional poetry. I'm the fictional, the fanciful use of I. And I called it A Book of Witness because I is the pronoun of testimony, of witness. And the I had been called into question by many of my contemporaries, trying to get away from lyrical, the interference of the ego in the poem. And this starts with a statement by Amiri Baraka, American poet. I can't say who I am. I can't say who I am, but go for it and speak it as if I knew it. Time is half the story, so is death. I run from shadows to avoid old people maddened by God. I follow animals whose eyes at night mirror my face. Seeing myself asleep, I touch my arm. I celebrate new forms of sex. I am frantic, knowing that nobody has a way out or a face more marked than mine. I was not born live. The case for memory grows weaker day by day. The more I know myself, the less I am. I hold on to a name because it suits me, but the voice behind it never was my own. And then I'll come to some recent poems. I've done poems like the Lorca Variations, for some other poets.
We have about 10 minutes, Jerome.
Huh?
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so this I'll wrap it up with this. So with that much behind me, I began early in the present century to engage in a series of auto variations in which I used the same procedures as with the Lorca Variations and a few other series along similar lines, but apply to earlier poems of my own as the works to draw from. The obvious difference in the first of these auto variations and in the many that followed is that I apply the same procedure as with the variations to an earlier work of my own, in this case, a series of poems called The Seven Hells of the Jikoku-zoshi. Jikoku-zoshi is a Japanese scroll of hells, and it also has customary titles, and I'm sometimes drawn as much to the customary titles as I am to the images. The first publication, the earlier work, goes back to 1962, and it has remained in print for many years now as part of the first gathering of my selected poetry, Poems for the Game of Silence. As with other variations, other translations for that matter, the procedure, if it works, doesn't so much annihilate the original version as bring it into a new dimension where both versions can lead an independent, if interlinked, existence. The almost 60-year gap between them adds its own strangeness to the mix. So the Jikoku-zoshi variations begin with two statements attributed to Henri Matisse, who was probably a bit younger than me when he spoke them. One should be able to rework an old work at least once to make sure that one has not fallen victim to one's nerves or to fate. Saying that to the Italian artist Gino Severini. And again, when you have achieved what you want in a certain area, when you have exploited the possibilities that lie in one direction, you must, when the time comes, change course, search for something new. So I'll read a poem from 1962, and then the auto variations, from the almost present. The seventh hell of smoke, where fire raisers try in vain to escape from a shower of hot sand falling from a cloud. And this is in the aftermath of Auschwitz and Hiroshima and so on. The houses of men are on fire. Pity the dead in their graves and the bones of the living. Pity the roof beams whose waters burn till they're ash. Pity the old clouds devoured by the clouds of hot sand and the sweat that's drawn out of metals. Pity that too. Pity the teeth robbed of gold, the bones when their skin falls away. Pity man's cry when the sun is born in his cities and the thunder breaks down his door. And pity the rain, for the rain falls on the deserts of man and is lost. If the mind is a house that has fallen, where will the eye find rest? The images rise from the marrow and cry in the blood. Pity man's voice in the smoke-filled days and his eyes in the darkness. Pity the sight of his eyes, for what can a man see in the darkness? What can he see but the children's bones and the dead sticks, but the places between spaces and the places of sand and the places of black teeth, the faraway places, the black sand carried and the black bones buried, the black veins hanging from the open skin and the blood changed to glass in the night. The eye of man is on fire. A green bird cries from his house and opens a red eye to death. The sun drops out of a pine tree, brushing the earth with its wings. But what can a man see in the morning? What can he see but the fire raisers? The shadow of the fire raisers lost in the smoke. The shadow of the smoke where the hot sand is falling. The fire raisers putting a torch to their arms. The green smoke ascending. Pity the children of man. Pity their bones when the skin falls away. Pity the skin devoured by fire. The fire devoured by fire. The mind of man is on fire, and where will his eye find rest? And variations on the hell of smoke in 5 parts. The houses of men are on fire. Pity the dead in their graves and the bones of the living. First he saw graves, and after that saw ashes strewn around and molten metal. The man was standing at his door, his mind so steeped in blood he seemed to drift in darkness. Children spun around him, changing places, scooping sand that burned like glass. So hot, he thought, will it not scorch the bird atop that pine tree? I'll call them fire raisers, and I'll watch them running through the smoke and how the smoke drains color from their skin, the man thought. Dead waters like the sweat that issues from his skin, like thunder that assaults him, that the man feels in his marrow, that his eyes search for in the darkness. Spaces open in his blood, and fire from the sun invades his darkest places. Shadows in the morning, long and thin and hot, fall on his skin, his arms, and sear his mind. And from the roof beams fire rises skyward, bones in the desert sand, so small and frail are all he sees. The images of cities disappear. The places where the man walks even now are hot and glowing through the smoke. On the man's skin, little teeth are biting, leaving traces red and green. The smoke is harbinger of death, and where the smoke is thickest, he will raise a torch and set the bones on fire. When he sees them flaming, he will rest. A man is what he is, not what he seems. For those we call the living clouds turn golden in the sun, black in the rain. All that is hidden from his eyes still issues from his voice, but leaves his eyes in darkness. With a stick he hobbles between places, feels the veins inside his right eye throbbing, and his left eye blinded by the smoke. Will the fire raisers flee on metal wings? those whom the man calls fire raisers, and will the fires they have wrought remain? Will he then have an eye to look, not one to see? Houses no longer homes, how hot the clouds are that enclose them. Between his teeth the cry shakes down the clouds, the rain breaks on the house in which the man, bereft and lonely, hones his side. More bones, more sand, and still more bones. A hot night follows, and his house sinks slowly in the earth. Why do the children spin around us? They are the ones the fire sweeps away, the fire frozen in the hell of smoke. So with that,